Hi everyone, it's Dana, and today I am in downtown Bismarck. Now for the last few years we have done a tour of downtown Bismarck, capital and farm country. With the state of the world right now, we decided to take it virtual, which allows the opportunity for a lot more people to see it. So I'll give a little bit of a history of downtown Bismarck and specifically how farming really helped create this prairie city. Now, farming in this region is not a new thing. It didn't start with the homesteaders that came at the end of the 19th century, but has been going on for hundreds of years. The Mandan and Hidatsa, they were farmers. They grew beans, corn, squash, and sunflowers. The beans, corns, and squash you'll know as the three sisters that they would sometimes grow together. And this region has always been known for fertile soil, for crops to grow, and for things to prosper. But since we're talking about Bismarck, the capital and farm country, we're going to jump ahead a little bit and discuss more of how this city started and the agricultural traditions that it has built upon. Now, to start our story, we are at the tracks of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Now, President Abraham Lincoln in 1864 signed an act to create the Northern Pacific Railroad. It would be the second transcontinental railroad, which would extend from Duluth, Minnesota, all the way to the Pacific coast, connecting this vast amount of country. Now, there were a few major problems of building the Northern Pacific Railroad in this region. One is that much of the land didn't belong to the United States. Through the Fort Laramie treaties of the 1850s and 1860s, much of the land belonged to the Lakota Nation. And many Lakota were understandably upset about this railroad being built. So in response, some, not all, Lakota attacked railroad workers and used force in order to try to stop this building from happening. In response, you get Camp Hancock, which is where I am right now, that was established in 1872, and Fort Abraham Lincoln, south of present-day Mandan, which was built in 1873. Another problem the Northern Pacific Railroad faced was lack of funding. The government wanted this railroad, but there was little demand for it. Northern Pacific needed a miracle. Enter Jay Cooke. Cooke was famous for having all but funded the Civil War, running a bond campaign that raised millions of dollars worth of bonds. The Northern Pacific Railroad solicited his help and got him to start selling stock for the railroad. Unfortunately, it was too much too soon. By the time the railroad reached Edwinton, later renamed Bismarck, Dakota Territory, Cooke's bank went bankrupt. This triggered the Panic of 1873, which spread to be a global recession. It took the railroad nearly a decade to recover. In that decade, Bismarck became known as the wickedest city in the West. Suddenly, there was no construction on the railroad, so you had workers without a job and troops who didn't have to defend the workers. And on top of that, with the Northern Pacific Railroad ending in Bismarck, gold prospectors came out that far and sometimes stayed. This created a rough-and-tumble environment, and soon, saloons and brothels began to line the streets. 4th Street became a hotbed of salacious activity, earning the nickname Murderer's Gulch or Bloody Fourth. Bismarck started to become less wild, and once construction of the railroad resumed, more families and communities traveled to Dakota Territory via the Northern Pacific Railroad in search of farmland. Once the railroad settled them, it also shipped in their supplies and shipped out their crops. The railroad became their lifeline to the rest of the world, which eventually led to some problems. To get to Bismarck to pursue their dreams of land ownership and farming, travelers had to arrive here, the Bismarck Depot. This depot was built in 1901. Before this structure, this site was home to the Sheridan House, a hotel whose lobby doubled as a train depot. It was here, among other locations, that Alexander Mackenzie conducted business. Mackenzie was a longtime Bismarcker and contractor for the railroad who had such close ties with the railroad leadership that they more or less used him as their local representative in Bismarck. He and his railroad cronies managed to manipulate Dakota politics for decades. A perfect example of this comes in 1883, when the Dakota Territory capital was moved from Yankton to Bismarck. Northern Pacific wanted the advantage of having the capital be along the railroad tracks, not further south in its current location of Yankton. With Mackenzie and the territorial governor on the railroad side, they worked in tandem to move the capital city. A relocation committee was formed, and the governor appointed Mackenzie to said committee. The law required that the committee hold its first meeting in Yankton, the current capital. Citizens of Yankton were concerned that the capital city would be moved, and planned on arresting members of the committee once they reached their city. But Boss Mackenzie had a plan. The meeting was called to order on a train traveling through Yankton at 5 a.m., and it was quickly decided to change all future meetings to outside of Yankton. The train never stopped, and the railroad got their way. Bismarck became the new capital of Dakota Territory in 1883. Mackenzie basically controlled North Dakota politics by giving free rail passes to favored politicians, choosing Republican candidates, giving these candidates massive campaign contributions, and offering federal jobs to those he favored. Many of these choices affected those who had traveled here to earn a living farming. Into the 1890s, farm prices were low and many farmers were not earning a living wage. They began to blame the railroads and milling companies. Soon, a progressive movement began forming to do something about this. Eventually, Alexander Mackenzie fell from power in Bismarck. In 1906, John Burke, known as Honest John, ran for governor. He was the Democratic candidate going up against Boss Mackenzie's Republican machine, campaigning aggressively against Mackenzie's corruption. His victory was so remarkable that it was called the Revolution of 1906. During his 3 terms, election reforms were passed and bribing politicians with railroad passes were banned. Mackenzie's influence was waning. At the Grand Pacific Hotel, Mackenzie got into a fistfight with a Democratic politician. By 1910, Mackenzie's reign had come to an end. St. Paul dominance, however, continued. Ed Patterson purchased the Sheridan House, the former hotel and depot, moved it across the street, bricked over it, and called it the Northwest Hotel. This was the main haunt of the Mackenzie ring for years, but in 1917, a radical change of power happened, and the Northwest Hotel became a new party stomping ground. The Nonpartisan League formed in 1915 after growing anger and resentment towards the railroad and grain elevators. Farmers were particularly upset at how they were treated at the elevators. Grain inspectors would pass a hand through a farmer's wheat and give it a low grade. But once it was shipped to the terminal elevator, said grain was stirred together with a higher grade grain and sold at that higher price. The farmers would receive pay for the lower grade. Because of this and other occurrences, North Dakotan farmers decided to take action. Alfred Townley started the Nonpartisan League by going around the state in a Model T Ford recruiting members. He encouraged new members to ask their neighbors to join as well. Their goal was to start state-owned and operated elevators and flour mills, state hail insurance, and fair grain grades. The party was successful in passing many of their goals, and by 1916, just a year after the party was founded, their candidate for governor was elected, as well as every other candidate they ran for the House and Senate. By 1917, they controlled every branch of state government except part of the legislature, the Senate. This would change in 1919 when the Nonpartisan League also controlled the Senate. The NPL would eventually meet at the Patterson Hotel. Built by Ed Patterson, it was the most luxurious hotel west of Minneapolis. It drew politicians for decades. Originally called the Mackenzie after Patterson's good friend Alexander, the hotel opened in 1911 and would eventually become the home of the NPL. It was also a hotbed of illegal activities, with stories of girls and booze being smuggled in. In the midst of all the political upheaval and changes, Oscar H. Will opened a seed company in 1882 in Bismarck. He and eventually his son George were game changers to North Dakota agriculture. Perhaps the single largest issue farmers faced was dependence on one crop. When wheat prices were down, the whole North Dakota economy was depressed. Will and his son recognized this problem and promoted diversification. He began breeding new crop varieties of corn, beans, and many other plants which could thrive in North Dakota. Significantly, Will recognized that the Mandan and Hidatsa had bred many varieties that were successful in this area and gave credit to them. In 1886, Son of a Star gave Will Hidatsa shield beans, which he bred into the Great Northern Bean. In fact, many of the catalog covers reflect scenes of harvest among the Mandan and Hidatsa. Bismarck and North Dakota as a whole is still very much rooted in agriculture. From the building of the Northern Pacific Railroad to Oscar Will and his seed company. I hope that you've enjoyed this program and learned a little bit more about this prairie city in North Dakota. I invite you to the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center to learn more about agriculture in North Dakota, from the first farmers up till present day. We have a lot of information within our center that works well with all of the other exhibits that we have. So I hope, again, that you enjoyed this program, and thank you for tuning in.